This is Tanzania, a beautiful country with miles of coastline, Africa's highest peak, Mount Kilimanjaro, and a rich history and culture. While humans have lived in the territory of today's Tanzania for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years, the country began life as a modern nation-state in the early 1960s, when British colonial rule formally left the region. Tanzania officially became a country on April 26, 1964, when two separate, recently independent regions, Tanganyika, known as mainland Tanzania, and Zanzibar Island, united and formed the Republic of Tanzania. You really can't mention the creation of Tanzania without talking about Julius Nyerere, the decisive anti-colonial socialist activist who went on to become Tanzania's first president, staying in the role for more than 20 years, from 1964 to 1985. Nyerere was the son of a Zanzibar chief. The Zanzibar are an indigenous group that have a long history of living in mainland Tanzania. In 1954, Nyerere set up the Tanganyika African National Union Party, and he governed Tanganyika as prime minister and then later as president between 1961 and 1964. When the two nations merged in 1964, Nyerere assumed the presidency. Once Nyerere came into office, he decided that the only way his country could develop is through the ideology that is known as African socialism. Nyerere was a staunch anti-colonialist and a passionate anti-capitalist. Prior to his ascension to the Tanzanian presidency, in 1963, Nyerere gave us some insight into his economic philosophy and stated, "In rejecting the capitalist attitude of mind which colonialism brought into Africa, we must reject also the capitalist methods which go with it." Although he was gravely mistaken, Nyerere believed colonialism and capitalism were synonymous. Therefore, in his mind, because colonialism was harmful and exploitative, he thought capitalism was too. Regrettably for the people of Tanzania, Nyerere's socialist policies plunged Tanzania into decades of state-centered central planning, which instead of helping to develop the nation, instead ended up hurting millions of Tanzanians. At independence, the country's new constitution declared that Tanzania would be a socialist state, where the accumulation of wealth by individuals was prevented. A few years later, in 1967, Nyerere issued the Arusha Declaration, which called for national self-reliance and asserted that the state had the right to control all the major means of production and exchange. Another policy pursued by Nyerere's government, known as Ujamaa, shows the devastating effects of socialist central planning. Ujamaa, which is the Kiswahili word for familyhood, was a policy focused on creating villages centered on collectivized farming, in which there would be no private property and everything would be shared by the village's inhabitants. Initially, Nyerere insisted that individuals could decide whether or not they wanted to live on Ujamaa villages, but within 2 years, few people, perhaps unsurprisingly, ended up moving to these areas. Therefore, in 1973, Nyerere's government decided to force much of the remaining rural population to resettle onto Ujamaa villages. In just 4 years, 11 million Tanzanians were relocated into what was the largest mass movement in Africa's history. Countless reports of coercion and brutality indicate that this relocation was far from a peaceful process. According to a university researcher from Mara, a region in the north of Tanzania, the officials decided that people should move immediately, and so the police, army, national service, and militiamen were mobilized to move the people. The researcher went on to say that people were ill-treated, harassed, and punished. And for those who questioned, they were told this is Nyerere's order. Another researcher from Shinyanga, a city in north-central Tanzania, noted that in some instances houses were burnt down when it was realized that some people, after having been moved, returned to their former houses again after a few days. Instead of bringing wealth and prosperity to an independent Tanzania, according to the late Ghanaian economist George Ayeti, Tanzania's continuous love affair with socialism led to economic ruin, oppression, and dictatorship. Ayeti once noted that in Tanzania, the agricultural economy was left devastated by state controls. Production of most crops showed a steady decline after 1974. In fact, things were so bad that between 1974 and 1977, the deficit recorded in cereals was more than 1 million tons. The government made up the shortfall of foods by importing cereals, but Tanzania's foreign exchange reserves were used up quickly, and in 1975, the IMF and World Bank had to step in and give Tanzania over 200,000 tons of food aid. According to IETI, the overall output of food crops only rose by 2.1% between 1970 and 1982, which was not enough to feed Tanzania's growing population. And, if you can believe it, although by 1979 about 90% of Tanzania's peasantry had been moved into Ujamaa villages, only 5% of agricultural output came from communal plots, a devastating statistic that shows just how inefficient these collectivized farming plots were. As author Martin Meredith noted, far from helping Tanzania to become more self-reliant and to reduce its dependence on the international market economy, Nyerere's Ujamaa program made it dependent for survival on foreign handouts. Tanzania's income per capita hardly grew at all during the latter half of Nyerere's tenure in office. Income per capita remained stagnant from 1974 to 1982, staying at just $210. The African socialism experiment in Tanzania ultimately failed, and the nation has struggled to develop in the years that followed Nyerere's tenure. GDP per capita remained low for decades after his rule. However, fortunately for Tanzania's 63 million residents, starting in the mid-1990s, things have drastically improved. Over the past 30 years, Tanzania's GDP per capita has increased by more than 600%. In 1993, Tanzania's GDP per capita was about $154. Today, that number has risen to $1,099, which is quite simply a massive increase. This greater wealth has meant Tanzanians are enjoying higher life expectancies, greater access to electricity, better sanitation, and better education than ever before. Nevertheless, there are certain things that are holding back the Tanzanian economy from maintaining the strong and sustained economic growth it needs. Over the past 10 years, Tanzania's economic freedom score has fallen slightly, a worrying sign when one understands just how important economic freedom is for economic development. Although it may sound like a vague term, economic freedom fundamentally boils down to the ability of every individual in a society to control his or her own labor and property. According to Fred McMahon, resident fellow at the Fraser Institute, when you look around the world, the countries that have the highest levels of prosperity, the highest levels of education, the longest lives, the best healthcare, all these countries have high levels of economic freedom. Here is a graph of Tanzania's economic freedom score over the past few decades. As you can see, Tanzania's score rises fairly substantially from 1980 to 2015, but in the last 5 years, the country's score has fallen slightly, which is an unfortunate and worrying decline. One problem that has hindered Tanzania's economic performance over the years is the fact that Tanzania's government is too large and taxes are simply too burdensome. According to the Fraser Institute, overly large government spending and taxation crowd out other economic activity and limit economic freedom. When individuals are paying high levels of taxes, the private sector suffers because individuals have less money to spend on buying products and expanding their businesses. Another policy area that has held back Tanzania is the lack of the rule of law and strong property rights. Economies thrive when there are sound and predictable legal structures that protect property rights for all in an equal and fair manner. Unfortunately, Tanzania has underperformed in this area for years, and it seems as if things have actually gotten worse over the past few decades. Tanzania's judiciary has become less independent, and their courts have become less impartial over time. These are worrying signs for a nation wanting to attract global investment and be seen as a good place to do business. Third, Tanzania can strengthen its economy by ensuring that economic freedom extends equally to women. If a nation is to thrive economically, that nation needs to make sure that laws treat women equally in economic matters. If it is more difficult for women to start a business, acquire a patent, or bring a discrepancy to court that impacts the workplace, then half of the country's entire population is at a severe disadvantage. While female labor force as a percentage of the total labor force has fallen over the years in Tanzania, women still make up about 49% of the entire Tanzanian workforce. Not extending economic freedom to these women will severely limit long-term growth. One final improvement Tanzania must make in order to enjoy sustained economic growth relates to improving its citizens' ability to buy and sell goods and services from across the world. For far too long, trade in Tanzania has been hampered by red tape. High compliance costs and excessive regulations on importers and exporters have made it costly to move goods in and out of this country. That makes costs higher for consumers and life worse for all Tanzanians. Tanzania is an exciting place. Its vast natural landscapes are truly stunning and teeming with potentially lucrative natural resources. Its coastline on the Indian Ocean is breathtaking and could provide ample trade routes to the east. While it's true Tanzania has had a challenging post-independence history, the nation has a lot of potential. Tanzania has the largest population of all East African countries. Its capital, Dar es Salaam, is one of the fastest growing cities in the entire world, and according to some estimates, towards the end of this century, the city will have a larger population than the country of France. If Tanzanians were given the freedom to innovate, trade, and compete without their government getting in the way, the results would be incredible. Encouragingly, it seems like Tanzanian government officials might be moving in a more free market direction. Several media outlets have written about the efforts of Samia Suluhu Hassan, the country's president, to make the nation more appealing to foreign investment. Samia has also been vocal in her support for the private sector, a positive sign that shows Tanzanian officials may, at long last, recognize the importance of greater economic freedom. If the Tanzanian government sticks to its word, this certainly won't be the last you hear about this East African giant. Thanks for watching! If you enjoy this video, you may find some of our other work interesting. Check out another video here. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button below, leave a comment, and follow the IATP on Twitter at @the_IATP.